Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, her weathered hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea. The Illinois breeze wafted through the screen door, carrying the scent of damp earth and mown grass. It was the kind of peaceful evening that made her grateful for the quiet countryside. But her son Daniel's sudden visit carried a different air. "Mom," he said, flashing his usual warm smile. He placed a manila folder on the counter between them. "Just a few papers to sign. It's nothing complicated, really. Just something for the house insurance." Margaret blinked. "Insurance? What kind of insurance, Daniel? I haven't made any changes." No, he said quickly. "It's just a procedural thing. You know how they are these days. More signatures, more forms. You don't have to read through it. I already talked to the agent. Just your signature here, here, and here." He handed her a pen and tapped on the flagged lines. Margaret glanced down. The documents were typed in dense legalese. Her name was printed neatly, as if it belonged more to paperwork than to her. The pages swam in front of her eyes, but something in her stomach curled. "Let me think on it," she said, setting the pen down. Daniel's smile tightened just slightly. "There's nothing to think about, Mom, but sure if it makes you feel better." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Her mind wandered back to when Daniel was a little boy, begging her to sign permission slips for field trips. Those were simpler times. Now her intuition buzzed with unease. She thought of George, her late husband, and how he always read every word before signing anything. "Always know what you're agreeing to, Maggie," he'd say. She rose early the next morning and placed the papers on the dining table, unopened. Daniel hadn't called. No follow-up, no urgency, just silence. That silence stretched into days, but the unease did not fade. And one evening, while watering the porch plants, she heard Daniel's voice. He was standing near his truck, talking on his phone. Margaret ducked behind the doorframe. "She doesn't suspect a thing," Daniel whispered. "She thinks it's insurance. Once it's signed, the house is ours." Margaret froze, her watering can tipping slightly. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from clarity. She hadn't signed. She wouldn't. But now she knew this wasn't just about insurance. It was about betrayal dressed as concern. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret knew she had to be sharper than ever. Margaret stood in the hallway of the farmhouse, her fingers brushing the edge of a picture frame that had hung in the same spot since 1978. It was a photo of her and Thomas on the porch, their first spring in the house. His arm around her, her head tilted toward him. He looked so alive there, eyes sharp, shirt sleeves rolled up, the sun catching his thick salt and pepper hair. That picture made her feel safe, even now. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the closet door next to the staircase. The air inside was cooler, laced with the scent of dust and pine wood. She reached up, standing on her toes, and pulled down a worn tin box labeled Taxes, 1999-2004. Inside, under layers of old receipts and canceled checks, was what she had been searching for. A yellowed envelope, brittle at the edges, with her name written in Thomas's handwriting. It read, "If they ever ask you to sign anything, call Gerald." Her heart stuttered. She hadn't seen Gerald Wallace in years, Thomas's old friend and their longtime lawyer. He had helped them write up the original deed to the property and had always insisted on one thing: make copies, keep records, never sign blind. At the time, she had laughed it off, calling him overly cautious. But Thomas had nodded seriously. "People change when land is involved," he'd said once after watching a neighbor get swindled by his own nephew. She sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the note. The ink was faded but legible. There were more lines beneath that first sentence. "You're kind. That's your strength. But don't let kindness make you blind. If they ever say it's just paperwork, trust your gut. And call Gerald. He has everything. Her mind snapped back to Daniel's voice. Just a few insurance papers, Mom. Standard stuff. His smile had been soft, almost gentle. But now, in the echo of her husband's words, it rang false. The kind of false that makes your skin itch and your stomach twist. Loneliness settled on her shoulders like a wool coat. She missed Thomas more than ever, not just for his presence, but for his clarity. For the way he'd always sensed when something wasn't right, even when everyone else played along. She pulled out a drawer and found her old address book. Most of the entries were crossed out, friends who'd moved away or passed on, but there it was. Gerald Wallace, Esquun, 555-0198. She stared at the number, memorizing it like a lifeline. She didn't want to believe her son would do something dishonest, but something deeper than belief, something instinctual, told her she had to prepare. Outside, the wind picked up. A screen door banged softly somewhere. Margaret stood up, slipped the letter back into its envelope, and walked to the rotary phone that still hung on the kitchen wall. Her hand hovered over the receiver. Then she dialed. "Wallace Law," came a gravelly voice. She took a breath. "Gerald, this is Margaret Holloway." A pause, then warmth. "Margaret, it's been a while." "Yes, it has. I think it's time we had that conversation. Thomas told me we might need one day." There was no surprise in Gerald's voice, just a quiet exhale and the rustle of papers being moved. "Come in tomorrow. Bring anything he left you. You're not the first widow to call me with a warning written in love." Margaret put down the phone, her fingers still curled. She looked around the kitchen. The walls had heard decades of laughter, of family dinners and midnight phone calls. Now, they would hold a different kind of moment, one of reckoning. She glanced back at the tin box and smiled softly. "You always were one step ahead, weren't you, Thomas?" But the smile didn't last. Because upstairs, behind a closed bedroom door, Daniel was already on another call, and the papers he wanted her to sign were just the begin. "Unning." Margaret stared at the yellowed envelope in her lap long after the call had ended. She didn't know if it was courage or instinct, but her hand reached for the phone again before the doubt could creep in. She pressed each number slowly, listening to the gentle whirl of the rotary. A faint click, then a ring. "Whitmore Associates," came a familiar, steady voice. "Gerald?" she asked, her voice thinner than she intended. A pause, then warmth. "Margaret Holloway. I was wondering when I'd hear from you." She let out a shaky laugh. "It's been a long time." "Thomas always said you'd call when it mattered most." She swallowed hard. "It matters now." Within the hour, Margaret found herself driving toward Gerald's office in the old part of town. The building hadn't changed much in 30 years. Red brick, green trim, the same brass plaque beside the door. She parked her car carefully, clutching the tin box she had brought along. Inside were Thomas's notes, the property deed, and a few old letters they'd exchanged over the years, her private proof of a life they had built and the one she feared was slipping away. Gerald was waiting in the lobby, taller than she remembered, though more bent in the shoulders. His white hair was combed neatly, and his eyes were just as sharp. "In here," he said gently, motioning her into his office. She sat in the armchair across from his desk, fingers twisting in her lap. He opened the tin box like a surgeon unsealing a patient's file. Carefully, he unfolded the documents and began reading. "You were right to come," he said after a long silence. This is important." Margaret's throat tightened. "My son asked me to sign something. He said it was for the house insurance, but I had a feeling." Gerald nodded, sliding a paper toward her. It was a photocopy of a deed transfer. Her name was there, her signature. But she'd never held that document be 4 in her life. "Your gut was right," he said. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. Margaret, this is serious. That signature, if you didn't write it, means someone forged your name." Her stomach dropped. "He's my son." "I've seen it before," Gerald said grimly. "Love can be blind, but the law isn't." She looked out the window at the slow-drifting clouds. "I keep thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm imagining things. But then I hear him whispering when he thinks I'm asleep. I see how he avoids looking me in the eye. It's like I'm no longer his mother, just an obstacle." Gerald leaned forward. "You're not alone in this. You're not the first elder client I've had to say this to. I wish you were. But unfortunately, this is happening more than you'd think, especially in rural counties where people think they can get away with cutting corners and borrowing legacies." Margaret's voice quivered. "And what do we do?" He opened a file drawer, pulled out a blank affidavit, and laid it flat. "We start by protecting what's yours. We file a formal dispute with the county office. We freeze any attempts at property transfer. I'll need a handwriting analysis and your original signature samples, and we get you evaluated by a doctor to confirm your mental soundness, just in case they try to spin a story." She blinked. "They could say I'm not well?" He nodded. "It's a common tactic. They'll call it concern. Say it's for your protection, but it's just a veil for control." Her hands tightened on her purse. "I trusted him. I trusted her. I even thought maybe I'd leave the farm to Grace, their daughter, someday." Gerald smiled softly. "There's still time for that. But this has to come first." Margaret exhaled deeply. The fear was still there, but now it had a name and a plan. She stood up, smoothing the fabric of her cardigan. "What do you need from me?" Gerald handed her a pen. "Your truth and your signature, this time on your terms." As she signed the affidavit, a strange peace washed over her. Not comfort, but momentum. She wasn't just reacting now. She was moving forward. But just as she turned to leave, Gerald said something that chilled her again. "Margaret," he called out. She turned at the door. "You should know. Your son isn't new at this. He's not just greedy. He's practiced. I represented another client years ago. A woman, also family, who lost everything because she waited too long." Margaret froze. "You're not the first elder client he's done this to." The house didn't feel like home anymore. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun spilling through the curtains onto the checkered vinyl. The air used to be filled with the smell of her husband's coffee and the sound of birds outside the window. But now it was silence that greeted her, hollow and heavy. The mail hadn't come again. That was the third time this week. No statements from the bank, no utility bills. Just silence. She glanced at the calendar, wondering if she was mistaken. But no, she always marked bill due dates with red ink. Something wasn't right. She shuffled to the hallway drawer where she kept her spare keys. The ones labeled neatly: barn, garage, old truck. The ones Thomas insisted she always have copies of. She opened the drawer. Empty. All of them. Gone. A chill ran through her chest. She turned, checking the kitchen door where she always left her purse. Her checkbook and identification had been in there last night, but now the bag sat zipped shut on the chair, feeling heavier than usual. She opened it slowly. The checkbook was still there, but the ID was not. She clutched the table to steady herself, her heart drumming in her ears. What was happening? Later that afternoon, Daniel dropped by unannounced. He strolled in like he owned the place, wearing that same carefully constructed smile. Margaret watched him as he poured himself a glass of lemonade, casually commenting on the rising costs of ease, shoulder care. "You know, Mom, he said, not meeting her eyes. You've been doing so much alone. We've been thinking maybe it's time to look into some kind of facility. Just so you have people around, Support. She didn't respond. And the house, he continued. It's a lot to keep up with, isn't it? Big place for one person. She stared at him, her own son, planting seeds to uproot her life. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Her husband's voice echoed in her mind. If they ask you to sign anything, call Gerald. She had, and Gerald had confirmed her fears. But this felt deeper. A campaign to make her doubt herself. Was this how they wore people down? Not through force, but through subtle, daily theft? By morning, she was exhausted. She stood by the mailbox when it finally arrived, hands trembling as she flipped through junk ads and catalogs. Nothing official, nothing with her name. Until someone cleared their throat behind her. She turned. It was Linda, her neighbor from 2 doors down, the one who often waved from her porch but rarely visited. Linda's eyes were sharp, lips pressed tight. She handed Margaret a small folded envelope. It was thick, the paper slightly wrinkled. I shouldn't get involved, Linda whispered, glancing around. But I saw something, and I think you need to read this. Before Margaret could say a word, Linda turned and walked away briskly, not looking back. Margaret clutched the envelope like a lifeline, her fingers trembling as she stepped back inside. She locked the door behind her. Whatever was inside, it wasn't junk mail, and it wasn't going to wait. Margaret sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope Linda had handed her. Her fingers hesitated on the flap as though the paper might burn her. For a long moment she simply listened, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the tick of the old wall clock. This was her house, her sanctuary, and yet here she was, afraid to open her own mail. Finally, she tore it open. Inside were several photocopied pages clipped together, legal forms. Margaret's eyes scanned the first page, confusion rising in her throat like bile. Across the top it read, Deed transfer and power of attorney. Her own name appeared on every page. Her own signature appeared at the bottom. But she had never seen this document before. She turned the page, and another. There was the county seal, the stamp, the recording number, filed just 2 weeks ago. According to this, Daniel had full control of the farm, the house, the accounts. According to this, she was no longer the owner of her own life. Margaret's stomach lurched. Her hands trembled as she ran a finger along the signature. It looked like hers, looping M, steady strokes, but something felt off. She thought of the morning she'd refused to sign his insurance papers. Had he prepared this anyway, behind her back? A low buzzing filled her ears. This is how it happens, she thought. Not with a bang, but with a pen you didn't hold. She stood, clutching the papers. The room seemed to tilt under her feet. She had raised Daniel, had held his hand through chicken pox, had sat at every school play, had stood beside him at his wedding. Now this. Her eyes blurred. She steadied herself on the counter and inhaled sharply. Panic clawed at her chest, but something else surged beneath it. Determination. She thought of Thomas's warning, of Gerald's calm voice on the phone. She reached for the rotary dial. Whitmore Associates, the receptionist answered. This is Marga. Brett Holloway, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I need to speak to Gerald. It's urgent. Minutes later, she was sitting in Gerald's office again, the papers spread across his mahogany desk like a crime scene. He adjusted his glasses, reading silently, his jaw tightening with every page. Finally, he looked up. You didn't sign this? No, she whispered. Never. He pushed the papers back toward her gently. Margaret, this is a forged document. A serious one. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The stamp, the filing, they created the illusion of legitimacy. But these signatures don't match your official samples, and you have never given anyone power of attorney. Margaret felt the room tilt again. "It's my son," she said quietly. "My own son." Gerald nodded grimly. "I've seen this before. A child, a nephew, a caretaker. They think they're entitled. They think no one will question them because family covers a multitude of sins. But the law doesn't work that way if we move fast." Margaret sat back, staring at the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. She remembered Thomas bringing her here once, after they'd bought the farm. "Gerald's thorough," he'd said. "He'll look out for us if I'm gone." Back then, she'd smiled at the thought, never imagining this moment would come. "What do we do?" she asked. Gerald leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We file a petition to void this transfer. We notify the county recorder immediately. We attach a handwriting analysis, your original signature samples, and your medical evaluation to preempt any claims of incapacity." Margaret blinked. "Medical evaluation?" He nodded. "It's a common tactic. They'll claim you're slipping, confused. We need proof that you're not." Her throat tightened. "He's my son. I never thought—" "I know." Gerald's voice softened. "It's not your fault. Love makes you, as trust. Trust makes us vulnerable. But you're here now, and you're still in time." Margaret wiped her eyes. "What happens if we're not fast enough?" Gerald's expression hardened. "Then he could sell, refinance, or encumber the property before we undo it. Once third parties are involved, it becomes a far bigger fight." Margaret straightened in her chair. "Then we'll be fast." She gathered the papers, sliding them back into the envelope. The fear was still there, but under it, a new resolve pulsed like a heartbeat. She had raised Daniel. She had taught him right from wrong. She would teach him one last lesson about consequences. Gerald stood as she did. "I'll draft the filings tonight. We'll submit first thing in the morning. Be prepared, Margaret. This may get ugly." She met his eyes. "It's already ugly. I'm just finally looking at it." He gave a small nod. "Good. That's the first step." She turned to leave, the envelope pressed against her chest like armor. At the door, Gerald called after her. "If we act fast," he said, his voice firm, "we can stop the transfer before it's finalized." Margaret looked back at him and nodded once. "Then let's act fast." Margaret placed the teapot on the stove and let the water heat, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. She had invited Daniel over under the pretense of talking things out, making peace, but her real plan was tucked inside the folder resting beside her armchair, the proof Gerald had given her. When Daniel walked in, he wore that same easy grin he'd always used to charm teachers, bosses, and now his mother. "Hey, Mom," he said, kissing her on the cheek. "Smells like chamomile." "It is," Margaret replied softly. "I thought we could talk." They sat across from each other in the living room, the same room where Daniel had once curled into her lap during thunderstorms. Now his eyes darted around, calculating. Margaret didn't waste time. She handed him the folder. "What's this?" he asked, flipping it open. Margaret watched the color drain from his face as she was ready. Margaret sat upright on the polished wooden bench, her palms resting in her lap, a soft handkerchief folded neatly between them. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, the kind of place where truth either stood tall or got buried beneath performance. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty that she had nothing to hide. Daniel sat across the aisle, his lawyer whispering in his ear like a stage director feeding lines. He looked confident, even a little smug. But Margaret had seen that face before, on playgrounds, during teenage tantrums, and now, in court. She knew it well. It was the face he wore when he thought he'd already won. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, A silver-haired woman named Judge Carter took her seat. Her gaze was direct and unhurried, as if she had seen 1,000 families come apart in rooms just like this one. Daniel's lawyer rose first. Your Honor, we are here today because we are concerned for Ms. Margaret Whitmore's well-being. My client, her son, acted only out of care and necessity. He believes she may no longer possess the mental acuity to manage complex legal and financial matters. Margaret sat still, her face blank. Inside, something turned. Slowly. We would like to submit a petition to uphold the deed transfer based on necessity and concern, the lawyer continued, as well as a psychiatric opinion Daniel obtained that suggests early cognitive decline. The judge turned her eyes to Gerald, who stood slowly. With respect, Your Honor, Gerald said clearly, we would like to present evidence that the document in question was forged. Furthermore, we have medical records and testimony from a licensed psychologist confirming Ms. Whitmore is not only competent, but far from any decline. Judge Carter nodded. Proceed. Dr. Leah Morgan, a kind-eyed psychologist, stepped up to the stand. She spoke clearly, kindly, but with unmistakable conviction. In my sessions with Ms. Whitmore, I observed full awareness, excellent memory retention, and decision-making capacity that would put some younger adults to shame. Daniel shifted in his seat. The judge turned to Margaret. Would you like to say anything? Margaret rose slowly. She didn't need to rehearse. Her truth had been lived. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was married for 48 years to a man who built our home with his own hands. I raised 3 children. I've managed this land, this home, our books, and our family, quietly and steadily, since 1973. I may be older now, but I know myself, and I know I didn't sign that paper. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't yell, but the silence after her words was loud. Gerald stepped forward again and placed a folder on the clerk's desk. This is the forensic report, he said. It compares Ms. Whitmore's signature on the alleged deed transfer to multiple verified samples. It also includes expert analysis noting tool pressure, ink flow, and digital manipulation. Judge Carter flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning quickly. She said nothing, but the furrow in her brow deepened. Margaret looked at Daniel. He couldn't meet her eyes. I'd also like to submit a character affidavit from Margaret's neighbors and longtime church members, Gerald added. They confirm her continued independence, mental clarity, and recent suspicious behavior observed around the property. Daniel's lawyer fidgeted. The judge finally looked up. It seems this case is more layered than initially presented. Before we continue, there is one last item submitted late yesterday. She reached into a sealed envelope that had been placed on her bench. It's a personal letter, dated, notarized, and submitted by Mr. Gerald Whitmore prior to his passing. It was intended for use only if legal disputes ever arose over his estate or property. The room went still. Margaret blinked, recognizing the envelope. She hadn't seen it in years. Her late husband had spoken about it once, briefly saying, I've made sure your name is protected, even if I'm not there to do it. Judge Carter broke the seal. Margaret held her breath. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, as the judge carefully unfolded the letter. The envelope was yellowed with age, edges crisp but fading, and the wax seal intact, bearing the initials T.W., Thomas Whitaker, Margaret's late husband. Margaret sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, every muscle frozen as though she were holding her breath for the voice she never thought she'd hear again. The judge looked over his glasses, voice low but steady. This letter was submitted to the court with verified signature authentication and matching witness statements, dated 5 weeks before Mr. Whitaker's passing. Margaret stared straight ahead, not daring to look at Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. The judge began to read aloud. To whom it may concern, and to the court that may one day read this. If you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer here. But I have no intention of leaving without protecting the woman who stood by me through war, through cancer, through empty bank accounts and overflowing joy. My wife, Margaret, is not just the heart of our home, she is the guardian of everything we built. A hush fell across the courtroom. She is to remain the legal owner of our home and land. I have made this clear in every draft of my will. If by some misfortune, any other paperwork surfaces, especially any that aims to challenge her control or diminish her dignity, I want this letter to serve as my voice, posthumously. Margaret's throat tightened. She could almost hear him saying it, not just the words, but the protective tone. The courtroom blurred for a moment, as tears pooled, but she blinked them away. She needed to hear this. All of it. The judge continued. I know people change when money gets involved. I've seen it in others, and though I hope this never happens in our family, I must write it plainly. If Margaret is ever coerced, manipulated, or deceived into signing anything, I contest it. If she's ever called confused or unstable, I demand a full medical review by independent professionals, not opinions from those with something to gain. There were gasps now. Even the opposing lawyer looked down at their notepad, clearly rattled. Margaret heard Daniel scoff. This is ridiculous. He was already sick when he wrote that. The judge didn't flinch. The letter has been authenticated. The witnesses, Mr. Whitaker's notary and longtime physician, provided signed statements. It stands. Gerald leaned slightly toward Margaret and whispered, That letter just knocked out their entire foundation. The judge turned another page. Lastly, let the world know, Margaret has more clarity, grace, and judgment than anyone I've ever known. If you doubt her mind, you doubt mine. If you disrespect her, you disrespect me. I trust her to decide what becomes of our legacy. She is, and always will be, the keeper of this home. With that, the judge gently folded the letter closed. The silence that followed felt louder than any shout. Margaret exhaled slowly, as if something long buried inside her had finally surfaced. For months, she had been gaslighted, treated as a fragile relic of her former self. But here was the one person who had seen her clearly until the end, and even beyond. The judge looked up, locking eyes with Daniel. This letter, combined with the original deed and verified will, supersedes the forged documents your legal team submitted. The court recognizes the pre-existing will as legally binding. The attempted property transfer is nulla finis bound. Daniel rose to protest, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, tight, cautioning. Even he could see the walls closing in. Margaret finally turned to face her son. She didn't gloat. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Her expression was unreadable, carved from quiet pain and a growing sense of peace. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from not letting yourself be erased. The judge cleared his throat one last time. This case is not just about property. It's about intent. It's about honoring the wishes of the deceased and protecting the living from betrayal disguised as care. And in that regard, the court finds overwhelmingly in Mrs. Whitaker's favor. A few soft claps broke out, perhaps a few too many for a courtroom, but no one was reprimanded. Even the court reporter gave a subtle nod toward Margaret. Gerald leaned back with a satisfied sigh. He couldn't have written it better. Your husband knew exactly what might happen. Margaret smiled faintly. He always did. Daniel stormed out without looking back, his footsteps heavy with denial. But Margaret didn't watch him go. Her gaze remained steady on the judge, on the bench, on the letter folded on the desk. That piece of paper, those words, had brought her back to herself. Later, outside the courthouse, Margaret stepped into the sunlight, clutching the now certified documents and the original letter, which the judge allowed her to keep. She felt the weight of legacy, of betrayal survived, of truth finally heard. And as she stood beneath the old oak trees lining the courthouse steps, she whispered, "Thank you, Thomas." Margaret sat in the courtroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her shoulders squared despite the weeks of turmoil behind her. She wore her late husband's favorite pin on her jacket, a small gold oak leaf, and kept her eyes steady on the judge. Daniel sat across the room, his expression unreadable, though his leg bounced with nervous energy. The courtroom was packed with quiet observers, some neighbors, some strangers, all drawn to the unfolding story of betrayal and justice. The judge cleared his throat and began reading his ruling. "After careful examination of the evidence," he said, "including the notarized documentation, verified expert testimony, and the personal letter from the deceased spouse, this court finds that the property transfer submitted by Mr. Daniel Whitman was indeed forged and executed without the knowledge or consent of Mrs. Margaret Whitman." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Relief didn't flood her. It crept in quietly, like sunrise warming a room after a long, cold night. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the court finds that Mrs. Whitman is of sound mind and fully capable of managing her estate. The will submitted by Mr. Gerald Whitmore, written by the late Mr. Whitman, and sealed in advance of these events, will be upheld in full." Daniel leaned forward, his mouth open. The judge held up a hand. "In light of the forged documents and the attempt to commit elder financial abuse," he said, "Mr. Whitman, you are hereby found guilty of fraud and document tampering." There was a collective murmur from the room. Daniel's lawyer whispered something to him, but he sat back in stunned silence. Margaret did not look at him. She had nothing left to say to a man who had tried to steal her future under the mask of family. The judge turned to her, his voice softer now. "Mrs. Whitman, you are hereby restored full ownership of your home, property, and finances. You may pursue criminal charges if you wish." Margaret stood slowly, each motion deliberate. "No, Your Honor. I won't pursue further punishment. I simply want what's mine, and my peace." There was something powerful about saying that out loud. She didn't want vengeance. She didn't want spectacle. She wanted her life back, and she was taking it. Outside the courtroom, reporters stood with cameras, but she kept her head down, walking with Gerald at her side. She ignored the flashbulbs, the questions, the whispers. Her story was not for public drama. It was for her own soul. At the end of the courthouse steps, she paused and turned to Gerald. "I need to update my will," she said firmly. He smiled. "I thought you might." Together, they stepped into the sunlit parking lot, leaving behind the cold marble halls where lies had unraveled and truth had taken root. Margaret wasn't just the woman who had survived the betrayal. She was the woman who rewrote the ending. Margaret sat beneath the fading autumn sun, the roses she'd just planted still settling into the soil. Their scent mingled with the woodsy breath of her old porch, newly stained by her own two hands, hands that had once been seen as weak, but had now reclaimed everything. Gerald arrived that morning with a briefcase and a warm smile. He had prepared the new will, exactly as she'd requested. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a declaration, a quiet thunder that echoed through everything she'd endured. She signed her name slowly, deliberately. No shaking hand, no hesitation. This time, it wasn't rushed. No one pressured her. No son stood over her shoulder with fake smiles or flimsy reassurances. Just her lawyer, her steady pen, and her iron will. She handed the signed will back to Gerald, who witnessed it along with Ruth, the neighbor who had stood by her through the storm. Margaret looked between them and smiled. "I'm leaving it all to Lily," she said. "She came back when I needed someone most." Gerald nodded. It's poetic. She never asked for a thing, and yet you're giving her the whole truth. Margaret exhaled. Because she never took anything. She just gave love. Quietly. Constantly. With the legalities done, Margaret walked through her home. Every creaking floorboard was a note in her symphony. She ran her fingers along picture frames she nearly lost. On the mantel, she placed the final copy of the judge's ruling, folded but accessible, just in case. Later, Lily arrived with cinnamon, on rolls and a wide-eyed look of admiration. "Grandma," she said softly, "everything feels different. Lighter." Margaret nodded. "That's what happens when you stop carrying lies." They sat together on the swing. Lily asked about the roses. Margaret told her they were her favorites, wild blush climbers, like the ones her husband once planted for their anniversary. He always said a house needs roots and blooms. As the sky turned lavender, Margaret took out a worn notebook. She handed it to Lily. "It's not just the house, sweetheart. It's the stories. Everything that made this place home." Inside were letters, recipes, bills of sale, birth certificates, and tucked between 2 pages, a photo of Margaret and her husband leaning against the porch railing just after it was built. Tears shimmered in Lily's eyes. "I'll take care of it." "I know," Margaret said. "That's why it's yours." They sat until the stars blinked on above them. Peace wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a rusted swing and the scent of fresh soil. As Lily prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the driveway. The moonlight touched her silver hair like a crown. She looked at the house, then at the roses, then at the sky. "My son asked me to sign," she whispered with a smile. "So I signed something else, my name where it belongs."